The movie begins in the White Mountain, Arizona, where laggard co-workers who are also friends are rushing down the mountain like madmen, frightened by something that they'd seen on the road. After driving through shrubs and ditches, the track comes to a sudden stop once they reach town. The four men get out of the car and walk into a local bar, and their faces contract in shock. As they sit around the table, still unable to accept what had happened, a waitress comes along and tells them that the kitchen was closed. When she sees their faces, she can immediately tell that they'd experienced something very strange. Mike, one of the frightened loggers, tells his friends that they'd be sticking to the story no matter how rough it gets. David tells Mike that they're all with him and that he should make the call. Getting his friend's approval, Mike heads out to the booth and looks at the phone for a second before dialing the numbers. On his way back to town, Lieutenant Frank gets a call from the sergeant informing him about the strange case. Accepting the call, Frank heads down to the bar where Mike and his friends were waiting for the police to arrive. When he gets there, he's greeted by the sheriff of the town, who appreciates Frank for having no unsolved cases during his entire career. The sheriff then continues to tell Frank about the strange case, and he explains that a group of boys had filed a missing persons report, which was Mike and his crew. The sheriff claims that he knows Mike and thought highly of him, and he calls over his deputy Dennis, who tells the lieutenant the names of the rest of the crew, which were David and Greg, who was also a high school student, and Robert and Alan. After things are cleared up, the sheriff thinks that it would be better for Frank to hear the rest of the story right from the horse's mouth. When Frank meets the group, they all seem to be open to cooperating except Alan, and ignoring the very loud-mouthed man, Frank focuses on Mike, who was the leader of the group. He starts to ask Mike about Travis, the friend that they'd lost on the road. Mike tells the lieutenant that Travis was his best friend and that they'd practically grown up together, and that morning, Mike had a fight with his wife about the bank loan and was in a foul mood when Travis got there on his bike. Travis, thinking of cheering up his friend, shows him a drawing he made of the future that he has planned for them. He'd wanted him and Mike to own a motor sales place, and Mike tells his friend that he can't be daydreaming right now because he has to finish the contract and pay for his mortgage. And although in disagreement, the two head off on the road, picking up the other loggers on the way. The six men head up to the mountain while enjoying a bit of banter in the car, and Alan and Travis don't seem to get along, and they start to fight until Mike shuts them up, and when they get there, the men start to work immediately, cleaning up the thick forest. Right around dusk, the group finishes the work and decides to head back, and back in the bar, Frank questions everyone if they were going along with Mike's story, which they confirmed. Suspicious of the aggressive man, Frank specifically asks him, and Alan responds sarcastically. He continues to question him about the bad blood he had with Travis, but Alan is adamant about it being simple fun and not anything serious. The sheriff had gotten tired of the banter and asked the boys to just tell the lieutenant what they'd seen. Alan, being the first one to see it, explains that it looks like fire. He pointed it out to the group who were in the car, who also found it to be very strange. At first, they had thought the hue of red was just the sun setting, but they soon realized that it set an hour ago. Mike was sure that it was a forest fire until the light started to move. Travis asks Mike to pull over so they could see what it was, but Mike refuses, telling him that it was a forest fire and that they'd be trapped inside. Suddenly, they are cut off by something in the sky, and Travis hurries out of the car to get a better look as the group screams for him to return. The hovering aircraft suddenly releases a bright light on Travis, which swings him across the field. Mike doesn't want to leave his friend out there, but the group forces him to drive before the spacecraft gets them too. After driving back in a hurry, Mike feels guilty about abandoning his friend and decides to go back. He asks the men to get out of the car and that he would return to pick them up after he finds Travis. And once the men get out, Mike rushes to the spot where they had seen Travis fall. When Mike returned, there was no sight of the body anywhere, even in the woods. Mike then tears up as he explains to Frank that he tried his best to find his friend, but he unfortunately couldn't. And Mike is sure that whatever it was that was hovering on top of them took Travis. Frank inspects the men for a few seconds and asks them if they actually think that he would believe their story. David tells Frank that they were being absolutely honest, and despite the men being adamant about their story, Frank remains skeptical and unmoved by the sheriff's trust in them. Frank tells them sarcastically that it was quite a story and asks them not to leave before the police get all their numbers and addresses. Outside, the sheriff and Frank investigate Mike's truck, which looked like it's been through hell and back. The sheriff assures the men that in the morning he would send dozens of police officers out into the woods to look for Travis. After being released from custody, Mike goes home and is confronted by his sister Dana, who was also Travis's girlfriend. Mike's wife Katie tells her husband that the news was all over the radio and that they were making it out to be a joke. And after assuring them that it was no joke, he tells his family that the police were going to send out a search party in the morning. The next morning, the 5 vloggers head out to the mountain along with the rest of the search party to find Travis. While they were trying to find the exact spot Travis was taken from, Mike is confronted by Dan, Travis's brother. He threatens that if anything happened to his brother, there would be consequences, and suddenly, the dogs find something and the group gathers to see what it is. After checking the bones the dogs have found, the sheriff deems them not human and the search continues. After a whole day of searching, Mike goes home and sits on his bed, thinking about what could have happened to his friend. And his annoying wife continues to badger him about the contract that he lost, and he tells her that he'd figure something out, surprised that she would even bring this up after what happened. Katie tells her husband that it wasn't just about the money, but also the fact that the townspeople were saying terrible things about him, and she assures him that she doesn't think the same, but she wants him to be honest with her. Mike, looking deeply into his wife's eyes, promises her that he had told her all he knew. That night, upset with what happened with his wife, Mike heads out to a local diner, and the old clerk tells Mike that he's been getting calls from all over about people coming to hear Mike and his friend's stories. And before he leaves, he tells the man to keep him being around a secret. The next morning, a camera crew arrives at Mike's house. Mike and David both receive to give any statement and hurry to their car, driving away from intruding eyes. When he gets into town, the people start pointing and gossiping about him, and at the dinner, they meet up with the rest of the crew before they're joined by Frank and the sheriff, who assures them that what was happening isn't personal. And the sheriff asks them to take a lie detector test, which would strengthen their cause. And Mike angrily tells them that they would think about it, and the sheriff leaves. Frank takes Mike outside and asks him why he hadn't been upfront about the altercation Alan and Travis had the day of the disappearance. When he doesn't get any answers, Frank looks at the man intently and tells him that he didn't think that he killed Travis, but couldn't understand why he would cover for Alan. And after the strange confrontation, Mike and David head off to find Alan, and they find him in his trailer and tell him about the lie detector test. And although Alan is reluctant about the test, Mike manages to convince him after a long argument. The news of the alien abduction attracts international attention, and the town is flooded with tourists, and the townspeople gather at town hall and complain about the strangers crowding the people. The people are adamant that they already know what happened, implicating Mike and his friends. Mike barges into town hall and tells the people that had once been his friends that he was disappointed with them for thinking that he was Travis. To prove himself and his crew were honest, he loudly agrees to take the test, and when the crew arrives for the test, they find the police station was full of paparazzi. Inside the station, they meet the expert who would be performing the lie detector test, and they get started. After hours of sitting in a quiet room and answering questions, Frank comes back with the answers and explains to the crew that their results were inconclusive, informing them that they would have to return again tomorrow. Angry about the way they've been treated, he starts yelling at Frank that they wouldn't be willing to do any more tests, and that if they wanted to press charges they could. And after the crew leaves, the expert tells the sheriff and Frank that in actuality the results were positive and that the boys were telling the truth. That night, back at his home, Mike gets a strange call from a gas station phone booth informing him that Travis was on the other line. Mike, Dana, Dan, and David all hurry out to the place Travis had told them that he was calling from, and when they get there, they find their friend naked and shivering in the cold, feeling disoriented from everything that happened. After giving him something to wear, they call the cops and wait for their arrival, and after a few hours, Travis starts becoming coherent and recognizes everyone. Then suddenly, Travis starts to experience a seizure after getting flashbacks of the things that happened to him while he was away. As he's rushed to the hospital, Travis continues to get flashbacks until he eventually loses consciousness. For the next few days, Travis remains in a traumatized state, speaking and eating very little. Franklin approaches the lost man and asks him a few questions, assuming that Travis had disappeared on purpose for the tabloids, and seeing that his memory wasn't all good, Franklin decides to leave him alone. When he gets home, Travis is greeted by all his friends and family, and for Travis, the flashback continues, and he's unable to deal with the cluster of people hiding underneath the table. In his memory, Travis sees himself waking up in a cocoon filled with something gooey, and confused about where he was, he breaks free of the elastic shell and starts looking around. Travis finds himself in a zero-gravity giant pod and is suspended in the air. Pulling himself up, he enters one of the other pods and finds the decaying body of another human being. Screaming, he pulls himself out, and now extremely scared, he starts to climb up to where he sees some type of light. While trying to escape, he's caught by the aliens and dragged into what seems like a strange lab, which makes him undergo several experiments while he's still awake. When he wakes up from his traumatizing and paralyzed state, Travis finds himself in his doctor's office with Dana, the sheriff, and Franklin sitting right next to him. Franklin is still distrustful of Travis's story and waits for the real one to come out. He tells the sheriff that all of this sounds like a well-rehearsed hoax, but the sheriff is doubtful. 2.5 years later, Travis and Dana are married with a child, and they've got another one on the way. In the kitchen, Travis kisses his wife and child goodbye before heading out. He then drives out to Mike's house, who now lives alone deep in the woods, and the two take a drive together and take him to the place Travis had been abducted from. Mike tells his old friend that he doesn't like the place, which Travis also agrees to, and Travis explains that he hasn't had a decent night of sleep ever since what happened, but he was trying to move on from the experience. Travis tells his friend that everyone misses him and that he should return to his normal life, and Travis apologizes for blaming Mike for what happened and accepts that it was his fault for getting out of the truck. And the movie ends as the two share a deep moment as they finally reconcile, agreeing to be friends again, and Mike and Travis get in Travis's car and drive away.